All right, diving into the world of Al Capone today. It's funny. He's one of those figures who never really fades away, does he? The name, the Scarface image, it's practically its own genre at this point. But who was he, really?
That's the million-dollar question. Everyone thinks they know Al Capone, but there's always more to uncover.
Exactly. And we've got some great material to dig into today, stuff that goes way beyond the typical gangster tropes.
What's often forgotten is that Capone's story isn't some rags-to-riches fairy tale. It's rooted in the realities of early 20th century America, the massive influx of immigrants, the social upheaval.
Right, like his family, coming from Italy, they weren't exactly greeted with open arms, were they?
Not quite. Imagine facing intense prejudice, being stereotyped as a criminal just because of where you came from. It was a very real barrier for Italian immigrants back then, often pushing them toward the fringes of society.
Makes you wonder how much that climate, that feeling of being an outsider, played into the rise of organized crime. The source mentions how many were just desperate for a better life, and then Prohibition hits, boom, this whole underground economy explodes.
Prohibition. It was supposed to be the cure, right? Clean up society. But instead, it became the disease. The law of unintended consequences in action, fueling the very thing it tried to eliminate. And figures like Capone, they thrived in that chaos.
It's true, almost like a dark irony. This grand experiment backfires, and from the ashes rises Al Capone. But he wasn't born into this world, was he? I mean, the source mentions a hardworking family, even signs of promise early on.
He wasn't some preordained mob boss, if that's what you mean. Apparently a bright kid, actually, until he got himself expelled. For, well, punching teacher.
Huh. See, I love those little details. You can practically draw a line from that schoolyard scrap all the way to the violence he'd become infamous for. Makes you wonder, when did Al Capone, ambitious kid, become Al Capone, the ruthless gangster?
That's the mystery, isn't it? And I think it speaks volumes about the influence of mentors, especially in that world. That's where Johnny Torrio comes in.
Ah, yes, Johnny Torrio, the original Chicago outfit mastermind. This source actually points out a really interesting contrast between his style and Capone's.
Night and day, some would say. Torrio, he was a strategist, understood the power of alliances, diplomacy, violence, sure, but always as a last resort.
Which makes you think, how much of that rubbed off on Capone? Because let's be real, restraint wasn't exactly his forte. And then, of course, there's a nickname that would come to define him, Scarface.
It's ironic, you know. The source mentions that Capone reportedly hated that nickname, felt self-conscious about those scars, even tried to hide them with makeup.
Really? Then that's fascinating. This brutal gangster, feared by so many, insecure about a scar. It just goes to show, image, perception, it's a powerful thing, even in the underworld. Speaking of image, I guess you can't talk about Capone and image without mentioning the Harvard Inn, right? That's where he got those famous scars.
Yeah, that's the one. Seems almost trivial in a way, but it changed everything for him. Made a remark to a woman, didn't realize she was connected to another gangster, Frank Galluccio.
Galluccio, yeah, not someone you want to mess with.
Understatement of the year. He takes offense, obviously, and decides to teach Capone a lesson. 3 slashes to the face later.
And just like that, Scarface is born.
It stuck with him, that's for sure.
Eh.
The source even says he hated the nickname, self-conscious about the whole thing. Tried covering it up, even.
Wow, really? I always imagined him using it to his advantage, you know?
Maybe to an extent. But imagine it, this guy who thrives on intimidation, secretly insecure about a few scars.
It's human, I guess. Just goes to show everyone's got their thing. But this all happened while he was still working under Torrio, right, in Chicago?
Right. Chicago in the 20s, it was a wild time. Prohibition was in full swing, and the city was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
And that spark, more often than not, was Al Capone.
He was Torrio's muscle, the enforcer. But he was also ambitious, saw an opportunity to make a name for himself.
And make a name he did. The source really paints a picture of the gang wars that exploded during that time.
Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. This was all-out war for control of the city, the bootlegging, the gambling, everything. Capone, he went up against some heavy hitters.
Yeah.
Deon O'Banion, the North Side Gang.
Don't forget the O'Donnell brothers. That was a whole saga in itself.
Right, the Irish gangs. They wanted their piece of the pie, too. It was chaos, a bloodbath. And right at the center of it all was Capone.
And then, of course, there's the granddaddy of them all, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. That one, even for Capone, it was a whole other level.
It's the event that defines him in a lot of ways, even though they could never definitively pin it on him.
7 men gunned down in broad daylight dressed as cops. It was like something out of a movie.
And that's just it, isn't it? It was like something out of a movie, so audacious, so cold-blooded. It captured the public's imagination. And whether he gave the order or not, the suspicion stuck.
Exactly. It became his calling card. But here's the thing that always gets me. For all that violence, all that ruthlessness, Capone also had this other side, right?
Oh, absolutely. The contradictions are fascinating. So, like, this is the same guy who opened soup kitchens during the Depression, gave away money to the poor.
I know, right? Makes you wonder, what was he trying to prove? Was it genuine compassion or just a way to clean up his image?
Maybe a bit of both. Some historians think he genuinely felt a responsibility to help his community, especially with so many struggling. Others see it as pure strategy, damage control for a notorious gangster.
Then there's that whole thing with the milk, right? The expiration dates.
Ah, that's a classic Capone tale. Supposedly, someone in his family got sick from spoiled milk, and he made it his personal mission to do something about it.
Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it?
Well, that's the thing. No one's ever been able to prove it actually happened.
But it doesn't matter, does it? The story persists because it plays into this idea of Capone as this complicated figure, this Robin Hood with a Tommy gun.
Exactly. We love a good redemption arc, even for a gangster. It's like maybe deep down he wasn't all bad.
I guess that's the enduring mystery of Al Capone, isn't it? The man, the myth, the contradictions. Yeah, and you know what really gets me about those contradictions? It's how his story ultimately ends. I mean, you'd think this guy, public enemy number one, goes out in a blaze of glory, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Well,
Some epic showdown, rivals closing in.
instead, it's the tax man, Elliot Ness and his untouchables.
Talk about irony. This larger-than-life figure brought down by something as banal as taxes.
It's kind of perfect, though, when you think about it. The source paints Ness as this Boy Scout, straight arrow, couldn't be intimidated.
Exactly. He was incorruptible, which made him a huge threat to someone like Capone, who'd built his empire on greased palms.
So Ness, he goes a different route, doesn't he? I mean, everyone else is chasing booze and bullets, but Ness, he sees the bigger picture.
Follow the money, right? It's always about the money.
And what brings down the mighty Al Capone? A receipt.
A single receipt. It says Frank paid $17,500 to Al. Just like that, the house of cards crumbles.
No amount of muscle could erase that paper trail. And that's it. Game over for Capone. 11 years, federal prison. Starts in Atlanta, then they ship him off to Alcatraz.
Alcatraz. Talk about adding insult to injury. This fortress island, most notorious prison in America.
Stripped of his power, his money, he's just another inmate.
The ultimate fall from grace. But listen to this. It gets even more ironic. The source talks about Capone's final years, how he was struggling with syphilis.
Oh, wow, yeah. Had it for years, apparently.
And get this, the guy was terrified of needles, could have gotten treatment, but the fear was too much.
Wow. Talk about your kingpins and your empires. Ends up, even Al Capone was just a man, huh? Full of contradictions, brought low by, well, himself in a lot of ways.
It really makes you think about legacy, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
This guy who loomed so large, in the end, he was human, just like the rest of us.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what's the takeaway here? Is it about Al Capone, the gangster, or Al Capone as a product of his times?
That's the question, isn't it? He's bigger than one man, right? It's about America, about Prohibition, about the allure of power, and the price you pay for it.
Well said. I guess some stories, they just keep us asking questions, generation after generation. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. Al Capone, he wasn't just a bankster, he was a reflection, even if a distorted one, of ourselves.